Hello, and welcome to a roundtable discussion on the results from the National Environmental Services Survey. The survey was conducted in association with CIWM, the ESA, Groundwork, letsrecycle.com, and ESS Expo, and gathered the thoughts and feelings of just under 1,500 environmental professionals across the UK. There were various interesting findings across a variety of topics, but today we're going to focus on some of the headline areas, which includes greenwashing, carbon offsetting schemes, support for government policy, particularly relevant with the general election this week, green skills gaps and diversity and recruitment within the environmental sector. If you haven't seen the report yet, this is available via the ESS website. And today I'm joined by a panel of experts to discuss some of the results and any impact on the wider environmental services sector. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Tim.
Yes, hi. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm the new president for the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, and I've been inaugurated almost 2 weeks now.
Charlotte.
Hi everyone, Charlotte Rule, Head of Climate and Energy Policy at the Environmental Services Association, so the trade body for the recycling and waste management sector.
And finally, Judy.
Hello, I'm Judy Ling Wong. I'm a poet and painter and environmentalist, probably best known as the honorary president of Black Environment Network for doing all the work on involving ethnic minorities in environmental participation.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So let's get going. So to help set the scene, we asked respondents 2 questions. Firstly, what is the biggest issue in environment and sustainability today? So if you want to have a little look at the responses, the top result was expansion of the circular economy, and the least popular answer was development of green infrastructure. Charlotte, what do you think of this? Do you agree with the respondents?
I think it's a really interesting kind of breakdown. I think what's interesting in particular for kind of our sector, the recycling and waste management sector, is I think we can fit into many of those different categories. So not just the expansion of the circular economy, but looking at, for example, advancement in green energy technologies, as well as green infrastructure. So we're looking at things like carbon capture, you have heat networks. Some members are looking at kind of green hydrogen. So I think as a sector, we can really kind of encompass quite a lot of these opportunities where often we're left out of a number of the conversations around net zero. I think in general, how the breakdown has come, I think I do agree. I think there's huge opportunity coming for green infrastructure. I think that will have a huge role for sectors beyond ours. So carbon capture and hydrogen, I think, will be huge in the coming years. And there's going to be a huge reliance on them to reach net zero by 2050. But I do think public awareness and engagement is also really important. We can't just be looking at this from a business point of view. We have to take along the public. And that will be kind of really important to help ensure that we as a collective can reach these kind of net zero goals.
Perfect. And Tim, would you agree? Are there any surprises there?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, looking at the sort of classes, I think it's very easy to sort of pick on them, excuse me, almost as high-level issues. Expansion of the circular economy, I mean, ultimately, what does that ultimately look like? What's that going to be? Because I got involved in waste management, and I said recently, one of my key desires and drivers was to do myself out of a job. You know, and ultimately, as we drive into this issue about how do we use materials better, it almost reads that's an issue about expanding recyclability. And that's not the story, because ultimately, if we really push hard on the circular economy, we're not generating waste at all. So, but we're not going to get there overnight. It's going to be something in the order of decades to move from this currently wasteful society to a wasteless society. And from my mind, it's almost flip sides of the same coin in terms of circular economy and the development of a green infrastructure. We can't just transition seamlessly from where we currently are to a different future. And we're going to need to have new infrastructure. I don't know if any of you were watching last night on Channel 4, Tim Harford and his views about how to develop and stabilize the economy and why we were in such a skint state. But one of the things he was saying was, we're not investing enough in infrastructure across the board. And we're kind of, one of the things we've been grappling with in our sector is this constant increasing gap between the stated ambition captured in policy and the actual actions that are needed to be done to make stuff happen. And that's increasing, and it leads to the issues we're getting onto shortly about greenwash. Because the gap between what we say we're going to do and what we're actually doing is not diminishing. It's actually growing, and it's growing substantially greater. And so to my mind, that sort of downplay of the need of infrastructure is a problem, because it allows us to almost fool ourselves into saying we're doing stuff by just drafting papers and position papers and views. So I think we tread on this warily, and something that struck in my mind from many, many years ago in terms of what was a sustainable future. And I've just had to note it down here very quickly. Our absorption of energy is phenomenal. And it said ultimately, to have a sustainable economy, you need to have alternative energy sources. You need to have energy minimization. You need to have renewable energy, and you need to have waste minimization. Because everything about us is fueled by energy. And it seems to me that we're framing everything through the lens now of net zero. It doesn't really take account of biodiversity. It doesn't take issue with regards to things like chemical limits and our poisoning ourselves. So it's almost overly simplistic to place these one against the other. What we need to do is to do more of almost all of these things. Expansion of the circular economy. Yes, we're still in the sort of the baby steps motion of what does a circular economy truly mean. Advancements in clean energy technologies. Absolutely, we need to major on that. But that's going to be very uncomfortable, because we're breaking out of the existing status quo, which is fighting back. And you can see things like, just stop oil and issues there where the laws and the judiciary now are stepping in to determine how to clip the wings of some of these more refined and specific action groups. Public awareness and engagement on sustainability. The language around that's very difficult to get your head around. The public, they don't know in many regards. Sustainability is used for everything. It's a catch-all phrase. And so when you're asking about public awareness and engagement, does that mean you go out and you count bugs, or you're a bird twitcher? Or does that mean you're actually picking up litter? What does it actually mean about engagement and awareness? Because you could know an awful lot about something, but not know anything about anything else. Strengthening policies and regulations, that scored quite heavily, 14%. Yet it's the legislative framework that defines exactly the world we live in. And you can see why there's significant pushback from social media when you can see the states, the likes of the UK or even the European Union, trying to corral what is appropriate. Because if it's not about kind of an extractive capitalism, it's very difficult to make your return to shareholders or stakeholders. So there is this issue about, we do need to have strong policies and regulations. We need to have them enforced correctly. And I'm not seeing that. And I haven't seen that for many years. I've seen that that's being weakened with various iterations of ministers. And then we have the small one, developing green infrastructure. So we're kind of downplaying what we need to do, almost like a wish list. Let's do big on the circular economy, but let's do little on actually making stuff or building things to deal with the outworkings of our consumption patterns. That's a long response, and I don't think I've actually answered your question.
No, that's perfect. And I think, we can see from the visual that it's quite tight between some of them. So I think these things are all important and should all be looked at. Judy, as someone with a more general environmental background, would you agree? Is it going to take decades?
Well, if we don't change the way we communicate, we will never get there. Certainly not in time to address human extinction. If you listen to Sir David King, he doesn't mince his words. He says, let's face the fact that human beings might be extinct. And then alongside it, face the fact that you have a choice, which is to see that we have all the technology and we know everything we need to do to really urgently act. But that urgency is not there. And when you home in on public awareness and so on, the quality of communication is dire. We're not getting them. Because at the moment, it's not being really fast, doing something really urgently. Otherwise, we're just not going to survive. I've actually been saying to people that, sometimes you say, oh, you're scaring them too much. I actually say they're not scared enough. And you need to really communicate a very dark message against the light, which is that you either make the right choice and we will survive, or else we're just not going to be there. And in that sense, I want public awareness to rise to the extent that pushes everything on that list. And when we talk about public, we tend to fragment professionals from ordinary people. I even think professionals are not scared enough. We just are not speaking out in strong enough a way to push the developments we all know need to happen, especially at international level across governments.
Great. Yeah, serious stuff.
Well, it's a really important point, because, you know, a quote that's coming up increasingly frequently is, everything must change for everything to stay the same. And, you know, we have this terrible naivety. And in some regards, it's sort of a purposeful, blinded naivety that actually this isn't too serious. Just because we've got a warm year this year means that it'll revert to natural next year, or it'll be better. It's quite nice to be a little bit warmer. And the severity and the seriousness of the issue is not being recognized. And in many regards, it's because it's very difficult to articulate this in a way, as Noam Chomsky would have said, to get across 15 minutes worth of concentrated, specific detail into a 5-minute soundbite. And it risks overwhelming the audience, and their immediate response is to switch off. And in many regards, reading the newspapers today, the birth, the growth, the expansion of things like home interior decorator shows, gardening shows, Love Island, are this atomization of society into things that I can control. I can control my body. I can control my space. I can control my garden. And in some regards, that allows me to disconnect from the bigger and wider societal issues, which becomes a real problem, because then people can zoom into that rabbit hole of whichever of those topics I've just mentioned they choose to follow. And that means they disconnect from engaging with their neighbors, engaging with their community, engaging with the broader or wider issues that face society.
Okay.
I think I completely agree with both of you. I think the challenge is we have to try and avoid that kind of climate paralysis. So we know that every action makes a difference. It's a road to net zero, not just individual actions. We have to make sure that even though we are communicating the scale, the challenge, the urgency of this, we have to make sure that we don't prevent people from stepping back and saying, it's too big for me, I can't get involved. We have to ensure that we're bringing people along. And so I think it's a really delicate balance between, you know, articulately saying the challenge that we're facing, whilst at the same time ensuring that people feel able to act and aren't just in this state of fear where they think it's too late and therefore there's no point in them getting involved.
They've got to get the message that we have everything we need to get there. I think that bright message has to stand behind the scary message. And they have got to have the basics. For example, people do not know the difference between net zero and real zero. Your net zero is a game. You can keep putting carbon up there while saying, I'm also doing these other things. And all that stuff about planting trees and so on is fast disappearing with the number of huge forests that are really being burned. We can't plant trees fast enough, you know, and people have understand that when you put carbon into the air, it will stay there for 300 to 1,000 years, which is why we're still suffering from the Industrial Revolution. They don't understand these basics. We've got to stop.
Right. And in reverse, what is the biggest issue in environment and sustainability? I can see that climate change and global warming is not surprisingly at the top of the list, with pollution at the bottom. Charlotte, what do you make of this?
I think it's interesting. I guess it draws on what Tim was saying earlier, that we're trying to segregate them up when they are all together and they all work together. In my mind, I see climate change and global warming as kind of an overarching theme that fits into all of them. But at the same time, you have these other crises. You have pollution, you have water, you have biodiversity, which seems to be missing from there, which I think is a really important one that's not there. And I think if we continue to look at them in silos, we won't actually deliver on any of them. We have to always see a solution in terms of multiple different lenses. So if you're looking at environment policy making, how does that influence industry? How does that influence energy transition? How does that help us to live a circular economy? How can it overall help mitigate this climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis? I think if we continue to break it up, I think it's very challenging, but I do understand the way of doing that to help address kind of the issue question. I think if you continue to look at it kind of at this huge scale, often that means that no one will be able to act. A little bit about what we were just talking about. If it helps to break down and kind of make it into digestible chunks, and I do think that that's useful. But I would agree that climate change is the biggest one. But yeah, the one that I think is really missing there is biodiversity. I think that's kind of a huge missing one, even though it may fall into that kind of pollution category, which I think should be a bit broader and should be larger.
And Judy, environmental policy and governance, what do you think about that being quite high up? Would you agree?
I completely agree with it being high up because they got the power to do something about the biggest one, which is climate change. You know, at the moment, that's the only thing that matters. Because unless we survive, well, we can forget about all the other things, you know. And with climate change, it actually does, it gives you an opportunity with this urgent contemporary story, which is different from all the stories in the past, because all the stories in the past was do something about this, about that, but we had time. This time we do not have time. This is the difference about that story and that theme. And I think we must use it in order to really, in a connected way, deliver the message that we have to act.
Great. And Tim, is it a surprise that waste management is kind of a medium point of the list?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, one of the lines I've been cited as quoting recently is that waste management has been a real victim of its own success. We have successfully, for over 120 years now, magicked away stuff from people's back doors, from society's doorstep. So it's just gone away. And we've spent an age and many generations magically doing that to allow people to not see the outworkings of their consumptive lifestyles. So we have facilitated this illusion that there isn't an issue, that there isn't a problem. And, you know, in terms of what we're talking about here this afternoon, it strikes me, you know, there's a lack of systems thinking, there's a lack of connectivity. And it reminds me about what John Muir, who is one of the fathers of the National Park Service in America, said. He said, when you pick up one thing, you pick up everything, because everything is connected to everything else. But we don't think like that. And we've been trained for the last, I don't know, a couple of 100 years to think in very linear manner about production, about consumption, about generation, about materials, and these sort of constant and very specific silos. And the reality is we're going to have to break out of that in short order to get a better handle on how we deal with things. And that's why I was mentioning about systems thinking. We have to think along the sort of production cycles of materials. We have to think about materials management right from the get-go, right from the inception of the material as a mineral type or as a produced fiber, all the way through to its end destination. So it's not just merely discarded or disposed of, but that it can be remanufactured from the get-go. So it's designed right from the outset for reuse, for repurposing. And that's when you begin to bring circularity in. But seeing waste management there, no, I'm not at all surprised, because going back to what I said at the start, you know, we've been victims of our own success. I would also just point out and take this moment to name check the BBC's Buried podcast. I know there's other podcasts available, but Michael Sheen, the Welsh actor, is highlighting an issue regarding PCPs, something we've forgotten about for a while. But these forever chemicals that were designed at this stage in the 1960s, they don't disappear. We merely put them aside. So one of the things I think we're going to hear a lot more about in the next 5 to 6 years, the next term of government, is the outworkings of chemical contamination. So again, a bit like the biodiversity not being on this, I think the recognition of the poisoning we've been doing to ourselves from chemical production and chemical absorption into our bodies is going to become much more high profile. And you've seen it with the likes of Mark Ruffalo and Dark Waters, the film. You know, you saw it previously with Aaron Brockovich in a previous film a couple of decades ago. These long-lasting chemicals, which are out there, and they don't get assimilated into the natural environment. They're just temporarily stored in either water bodies or in soil or increasingly in the air. So we're dealing with a jumble of things here. As Judy rightly says, though, ultimately, we're moving beyond the temperature range in which we evolved. We're getting into new territory here now at a global level. We have not been in a temperature which is 2 degrees warmer globally than it was when we started out. So we're going to see a whole raft of stuff which we just were not aware of before around things like heat islands and heat domes. Heaven forbid that Michael Mosley thought he was going to die on a Greek island. I mean, that's the most unexpected development, certainly for this summer. And a guy who absolutely went out of his way to be as healthy and as physically active as possible and to challenge many of our perceptions, gets caught out by a strange heat anomaly. So, yeah, I can see that it's very easy to cast much of this stuff in the context of climate change, but it's how to make it real and how to connect it with the other aspects in that list you have there, as well as others that are not yet fully articulated or fully defined.
Right. Well, you spoke about government. The next slide is on support for government policy. And it says here, less than 10% of respondents felt that government policies were fully supportive in achieving net zero goals. And while 37% of respondents felt the policies unsupportive, 22% felt neutral. Judy, what would you say on this? Would you agree with
I'm not surprised. I mean, we are all losing trust in all sorts of things. And of course, on the environment side, we have the government posturing, saying, oh, you know, if we invest in any environmental actions, your tax will go up. And creating sort of culture wars and deflecting from the main issues in a way that you really have no confidence that they're going to do anything serious and enough to really help the situation.
Yeah. Tim, were you expecting more from the manifestos in particular in terms of net zero mentions?
Yes and no. It's very difficult for government to say stuff like this, because as a political party, when you're stepping up to the plate seeking election, if you go too heavy and too hard, all it requires is some other political party to frame you in the negative and say, well, whatever they're saying, we're not going to do. And you can see that tussle at the minute between the Conservatives and Labour, whereby you've got the current Prime Minister doing his utmost to try and portray Labour as being the irresponsible party, as being the party that's going to drive up taxes. And you can see Labour's response, trying to get off the hook, saying we're not the party who's trying to drive up taxes. So suddenly this has become a manifesto or a face-off around jobs, around taxes, around the problems of finance. And it's squeezed to the margins, those other points, those other finer issues. And that's a real problem, because it means that the public don't see these issues being brought to the top table. They don't see them being framed in a way that they can either respond to or that they can internalize. So we're ending up with a kind of I mentioned it before, a kind of a purposeful naivety. We're purposefully blinding ourselves to what's important here, because ultimately we do not address some of these bigger issues. The points that are being articulated or are being fought over become a sideshow. But they're a sideshow that people can understand. Whereas the big issue, and one of the issues we have here, is that most of our political class do not have a science or an engineering background. And therefore they're being gifted stuff to speak about, which doesn't fit easily in their own words. They can't speak to it fluently and naturally because it's not their world. It's not of their world. And if anybody was to catch them on the hop and ask them difficult questions, they wouldn't be comfortable in coming up with a reply or a response. So they stick to stuff that everybody can relate to: jobs, economy, housing, while avoiding issues which are much more contestable, such as water pollution, such as longevity. I mean, one of the lines that struck in my mind was when a former prime minister said, "Don't worry about history. No need to worry about history anymore. It's irrelevant." Nothing could be further from the truth. But also things like what we talk about, oh, well, we've got to get our GDP back up and running. Our GDP is the lowest in the G7 nations. GDP is a very false measure. And again, Tim Harford covered this briefly last night on Channel 4. And you're going to, ultimately, GDP is the extraction of materials and that creation of wealth from something. So how is that done? And if you are creating something from nothing, is there not an externality there that has not been correctly costed? And if it hasn't been correctly costed, who is bearing that cost? So we are dealing with things in a very, very purposefully naive, innocent, and blinded manner because it suits our purposes collectively as a societal level. And unfortunately, some of the arguments that Judy and the like are trying to get across just struggle for airplay in that space because it's not what people want to hear or really desire to hear. I'm the same. You know, people don't invite me to dinner parties to talk like this because it's hardly going to boost their feel-good factor. And instead, it's a bit like the opium of the masses. We create these events for ourselves, which allow ourselves to be distracted from the severity or the seriousness of what we're facing.
Of course. And Charlotte, what would you say the new government could do to kind of engage people more with this subject, and how can they kind of get people on side and work on net zero?
I think that's a really interesting question. It does come back to this survey. So we've got 41% that's supportive and 37% that's unsupportive. And I think the new government needs to learn from the past. So learn from what hasn't worked, but also learn from what has worked. So if we look at current government policies, I think the real win is the overarching framework that we have. We have a legal commitment to reach net zero by 2050. That is a huge win and something that we should be supportive of and should acknowledge. What we don't have is the action and the ability to get there at the moment. There has been a lot of inconsistency with government policy, a lot of switching of narratives, which I think has really undermined everyone's confidence in investing if you're from an industrial point of view, an industry point of view, but also from kind of a individual and a citizen point of view. If you see government changing their narratives week from week about net zero, about how we should address it, you're undermining that confidence. And so I think that's what the new government can really focus on. I think it needs to be clear in their long-term ambitions, and they have to be consistent in how they maintain those. If they're talking about policies, they have to remain in place. You have to ensure that there is a long-term consistency so that people can invest in that and make the changes that will help us reach net zero. So I think that's kind of the main thing that we can learn for the new government. I also think it's really important that we deliver on those. So if we look at the policies for the recycling and waste management sector, we've had the resource and waste strategy since 2018. It's only just now starting to be delivered. We're only just starting to see some of the actual detail behind those policies. That timeline just isn't sufficient for how we're going to address net zero. We can look at some policies which have been really efficient. So the rollout of carbon capture, that's happened at pace. That's from a different department to those tackling kind of resource and waste management. So I think there is a whole range of things we can learn. So ensuring delivering at pace, but ensuring that consistency is there so that people can actually make those changes themselves.
Great. So yeah, it's clear that the government need to work together. And that brings us on to importance of partnerships and technology in achieving net zero. So on partnerships, 85% believe partnerships are essential or at least very important in achieving net zero. Tim, what would you say? How important are partnerships to achieving net zero?
I think partnerships are absolutely critical. I mentioned a few minutes ago about the idea of collaboration and collaborating across the supply chain. I wear a variety of hats, and one of the hats I wear is for the Advisory Committee on Packaging, which has meant for the last 4 or 5 years, I've worked with those throughout the packaging chain, from the producers to the manufacturers, the distributors, the importers, exporters, through to ourselves in the waste industry, but also just seeing how the sector, how the different sectors understand, appreciate, can grapple with issues across that span. It's very easy when you're working in your own area, your own sector, not to be aware of what the consequence of your actions are. So I think the partnership thing is really important. I think the ACP provides a really good example of where we have begun to see a better understanding and a better appreciation of what manufacturers, what range of materials, what is the flow through the system to the likes of ourselves. So we're having conversations directly with some of the big manufacturers, Procter & Gamble, Nestle and stuff, to say, you're producing this complexity of material, and then you're expecting us to bring it back to you. How do we do that? And especially picking up on Charlotte's point, now that we're seeing things like extended producer responsibility coming in, you can see some of the big producers are beginning to take this seriously, going, what do we need to do to make it easier for you in the waste sector and resources sector to disaggregate these materials from the overall mass of waste that that we deal with, so that we can get our hands on it again. So there is that fostering of conversation across boundaries is really, really important. And I think also, going back to some of our earlier conversations, to achieve the level of scale that we need to address things like net zero, like climate change, we're going to need to create new partnerships and new alliances to convey what's needed to the public in a way that's less spooky the horses, but more that here's the steps you need to take in the way you're living your life. For small steps can make a significant difference if everybody takes them. And I think that kind of re-articulation and reimagining. And I have to say, one of the things that struck me today, and this is speaking completely off the cuff, I saw that William Morrison's, the supermarket chain, is 125 years old. And the Institute of Waste Management is 126 years old. So I was wondering, should we talk to W.M. Morrison and say, we're almost the same age? Given where you are in the packaging chain and given what we deal with as a sector, should we be doing something together to get across, to convey this message in a different manner? It's that kind of reorienting, reimagining of what's needed. I saw Biffa last week, one of the big waste management companies, was highlighting that we're not going to address circularity without far greater change in terms of collaboration across the piece. They chose to focus on plastics and how to recover plastics far better. And that is a really big issue. So without a doubt, we need better partnerships. We need new partnerships. And it goes back to that misquote to Einstein. You know, we're not going to change where we are now without changing how we think, or insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. You know, we do need to do something different because we can't do more of the same.
Right. And Charlotte, what would you say to the 1% that voted not important to partnerships?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting 1%. I think I completely reiterate everything that Tim just said. I think partnerships are essential for achieving net zero emissions. I think just building on that, I think it's enable learning. If you can implement something and kind of disseminate that information, it can help us all kind of deliver that at the pace and scale that we need to reach net zero emissions. So I would say to that 1% to kind of maybe look at what they're doing, look maybe internally, look at their systems, their working environment, and see how that has been benefited by partnerships. How can they learn from that on a more environmental scale? What can they do that can help achieve that? And I guess, yeah, looking at what issues that you have in your own corporations and seeing how that can be benefited by others. I think we have to ensure that everyone is talking to one another. If we continue working in these silos, this system thinking that we were talking about earlier, I think is really essential. And so learning from one another is key. And so I hope that 1% can have a think and understand where they can get value from partnerships in kind of the environmental space.
Great. And Judy, what value is there in partnerships, particularly in achieving net zero, would you say?
I wonder what kind of organizations come into people's minds when you ask them that question. Because I think we desperately need partnerships between any facet of the environmental sector and the communication sector, the social scientists, and so on, so that we all tell a better story. That is what is urgently needed to get us somewhere. There's information everywhere. If you want information, you type in a keyword on the internet, you'll get everything. We're flooded with information. But the thing is, do you want to do that? Why do you want to know? Why do you want to act? That is the crux of the matter. And we need partnership with those who can really communicate and tell a much better story to bring people on. Great.
And with technology, almost 100% believe that technology has a role to play in accelerating the path to net zero. Judy, I know you said earlier that we have everything we need in order to achieve net zero. Do you think technology is included in that?
Yes, technology is included, and it is very important because technology has given us many solutions, but it also has given us, in this urgent era, a false confidence that we can do it fast. That what we do not know, we can be ahead and we don't need to worry. I think that is the huge issue.
Charlotte, would you agree?
I would agree with that. I think technology does play a critical role, but we have to also ensure that we are avoiding in the first place. So I think technology will fall into kind of the final category about how can we increase our efficiency? How can we help capture kind of the emissions that we have left? But as a waste management sector, but also across all of the sectors, we have to ensure that we are avoiding our emissions in the first place. And making sure that we are designing in a way that can ensure circularity. And I do think technology comes into that at the same time. I think you've got the large scale. So for our sector, kind of the large scale technology like heat networks, trying to make sure that we're using up as much of that spare heat that we have, looking at carbon capture that's going to be deployed at scale across the UK. You've got a huge round of, huge technology, but you've also got small technology. So looking at how kind of efficiency changes can happen in the way that you operate your business. How can you change how your waste management trucks are, change the schedule there to help reduce your emissions, stop idling, all very small things that technology can help. I think also there's a huge growth of AI and how that can be useful in our sector. I think you also have to remember the downside of that and the amount of electricity you're using and making sure that you've got this system thinking about how that all comes together. But I do think technology is going to be a huge part of our net zero transition. But we have to ensure that it's not just seen as the kind of golden bullet, that we have to ensure that we are doing everything else in our power to reduce our emissions in the same place. So you have kind of a whole scheme of activities you're doing, not just a reliance on technology, and not just waiting on that to deliver your kind of perfect means of achieving net zero emissions.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, speaking to people within the waste sector and speaking about robotics, which is becoming really popular at the moment within the waste sector, people are saying, as much as robotics will be great for picking out the correct rubbish and things like that, there will always be a person at some point, and they feel that is required most of the time, whether that be someone putting something in the correct bin or sorting rubbish. Tim, would you agree that people are still required?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, we're the users of technology, so technology is there designed to enhance or simplify our lives. But for that purpose, I would be a little bit wary that this response is kind of a response to allow people to ignore making changes to their own lifestyle because they expect that somewhere, somehow, this technological bubble will intervene, which means that they don't need to do anything. It just automatically solves the problem. And it goes back to some of the comments earlier on that were being made, even that I made, that for everything to change, for everything to stay the same, everything must change. Technology is kind of being touted as this wave whereby it's okay, we'll magic bullet this. Yet there's some great movies. I've cited a few already. Snowpiercer, the movie where they went and they seeded the clouds full of iron filings, and they couldn't control then the collapse and the temperature, ending up in a glacial world, a snowball world. So the world's solution was to put everybody on a train. There's all these unintended consequences arising from technology. What is this technology? How is it built? What are the resources drawing in from that? Ultimately, going back to what Judy says, we have all the solutions, all the answers, and all the requirements at our fingertips already, but just some of it's unpalatable. So looking at the likes of Materials Focus is showing that we're going to be increasing in the UK to become the world's largest producer of product. That's everything from earbuds, which we casually discard, to cables for our phones, which I regularly pick up on the street. We are so wasteful. It is unbelievable. And we don't seem capable of recognizing that we have to step back from this. We can't do more of this. And we use things like technology. We use things like AI going, it's okay, we'll sort this out. The textile industry is in a state of collapse. because of cheap clothing coming down the pipeline from Shein and the like, from Temu, from Boohoo and ASOS, which are all being built and produced in a range of factory types that, again, we don't really want to know about. All we're looking for is the cheapness of it. And there's a very good ad on one of the social media platforms at the minute, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, which is confronting people with how come this clothing is so cheap. And then they're posing the question, ultimately going, you now know why it's so cheap, because of child labor, because of slave labor, because of modern slavery and the like. Would you still buy it? And the answer is, yeah, because it's cheap. And so we're sort of almost Janus-like, looking two ways at once. We're increasingly aware that we need to have fundamental seismic change, but at the same time, we're looking for any reason or any excuse not to take those steps. So the latest one is AI will sort all this out. Now, AI will have a role to play, absolutely, but I don't think it's going to be that silver bullet. You know, and having spent 30 years, many of which were at times knocking on doors to speak to people individually about sort of what was required to change rubbish, waste habits. This is very difficult stuff, because you're asking people to fundamentally alter, to fundamentally recognize that where they're at is not an end game, and recognizing along the way they're on a journey, or as CIWM sometimes talks about, an expedition, because we don't know where the end game on this will be. But we tend to live our life as if what we're doing right now is the be all and end all, without recognizing that every year change comes. Every year our tastes change. Every year our habits change. But we're creatures of habit, and we like habit. And therefore, as we get older, we become more settled in our ways. Even the language I'm using now begins to demonstrate that kind of aging process, where we become more and more inflexible. And as we have an aging population, that's not going to be terribly conducive to facilitating systematic change. So I think the technology, yes, technology will absolutely have a role to play, but the concern would be, or the wariness would be, if we hold this up as being some kind of a holy grail that will absolve us doing anything ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, guys. Moving on to the slightly controversial topic of greenwashing now, where 81% of respondents, which is well over 1,000, felt greenwashing was very or somewhat prevalent. Charlotte, what are your thoughts? Do you see greenwashing as commonplace?
I'm not sure about commonplace, but I can understand why so many are concerned about it. I think when you talk about kind of the environment and what you're doing, you have to ensure that you are acting upon that. You have to ensure that what you're saying matches your actions. And I think that is where this concern is coming from in terms of greenwashing. I think you've got to make sure that you are, practicing what you preach. And I think that fundamentally comes from a huge amount of drive in the most recent years to have these net zero goals. But for many people, we're seeing that there isn't actually much work we can do to actually achieve that without kind of an overarching support from government. So I think there's a lot of work that's been going on and the industry are trying to achieve, but we need that overarching support to help deliver on that. And so I think the inconsistency and the challenges in achieving that has been kind of a big hindrance. But I do think there's a huge amount of work that people have been doing, and there is a lot of action that's happening. But I can understand where this challenge for greenwashing comes in. And I think a lot of that comes from an overarching need for government regulation about what can be said, looking at advertising, for example, and making sure that those that pollute the most aren't kind of greenwashing what they're saying and not actually kind of reiterating what they do. So making sure that you have that kind of a realistic portrayal of what your industry is. But at the same time, I do think we have to be careful not to prevent people from trying to make action and trying to do their best to achieve net zero. And sometimes that means that you fall short of what you're trying to achieve. But I think there's a delicate balance between greenwashing and really trying to achieve net zero.
Yeah, I can understand how they might feel stuck. They can only get so far. Judy, who would you say are the main offenders, whether that be across industries or in particular? What do you think?
I think the interesting thing about the whole perception of greenwashing is that the general public is actually becoming more aware. So they will say, oh, if you're not green enough, I will choose and put my money elsewhere to someone who is greener. And this is frightening industry. And their response is, we need to greenwash more because we need your money. And I think that greenwashing in a way is an indicator that being green has arrived as a societal theme, which I think is a good thing.
Great. Tim, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see that greenwashing is now being presented and called out. I think it's becoming a catch-all phrase, and many people are almost using it as a sort of a gaslighting phrase. So if I'm hearing something from you that I don't quite agree with, it doesn't fit within my green narrative, I'll accuse you of greenwashing because you're claiming something that that I don't concur with. I suppose the issue we're going to find is that as we move through the bubble of transition from where we are now to where we need to be, as that bubble moves, what we start off with thinking as being good green action actually will increasingly be seen as less good. And it will then be accused of greenwashing. So it's a very flexible and very variable phrase. I think one of the issues we have with the manufacturing industry, with the current linear production model, is obviously the existing linear model is trying to get you to continue to buy stuff. And yet at the same time, they're trying to demonstrate their environmental credentials, their ESG credentials. So the issue is, how do they encourage you to continue to buy stuff while also giving themselves a green halo? So ultimately in the mix, we're going to bump into this issue about, are we going to save the world by buying more stuff? I mean, one of the issues we have at the minute is there's enough textiles out there to clothe 6 generations of people.
Wow.
So if we did not buy any more clothes, that is effectively about 180 years worth of clothing in the system today. But you don't see any of the big clothing brands saying, don't buy from us, give us back stuff and we'll purpose it. Now, they're beginning to articulate some of the more pioneering ones like this, but not at the scale or the volume that we actually need. And you're increasingly now seeing things like the Ghanaian dumps on the seashore from space, where clothing is dumped en masse. The ones in the Atacama Desert, where some of the big brands just dump their stuff that they can't get rid of. A few years ago, Burberry were castigated for incinerating clothing rather than sell it at a discount. So there is a huge amount of materiality in terms of materials, products, that is out there that actually is unnecessary. And we go on holiday to various places around the globe, and we see the sheer amount of tat that's for sale, that is single-use plastic writ large, the toys that we buy our kids when we're away and we leave behind. So yeah, greenwashing, I think, is going to be with us for a long time, and it's going to become increasingly challenging for some companies and increasingly widely used by the marketing agencies, both for and against their client companies. And of course, big industry, the likes of some of the oil, the gas, the tobacco industry and stuff will be moving into this space. Look at the way vapes were originally proposed as being a healthy alternative to smoking. So we're in this constant state of flux. And it's something that goes on all the time, but we're kind of blind to it unless we know where to look. So yeah, greenwashing is just bringing this more into the public space at the minute.
Right. Next, on to carbon offsetting schemes. 80% of respondents have concerns about the credibility and transparency of carbon offsetting schemes, and only 33% of respondents believe offsetting is a viable strategy for achieving net zero. Judy, do you have any thoughts on this? Any experience of carbon offsetting schemes?
Yes, I think that there have been stories coming out about challenging the credibility of many of the things that industry use and so on, and say that if we do this, then then it will offset the carbon we're putting into the air and so on, and really undermining some of it. And I think that the thing about carbon offsetting is that, like I said, net zero is a bit of a game, you know. People are allowed to keep putting carbon into the air as long as they somehow demonstrate how they might so-called balance it by producing other things and so on. But in the end, in an urgent situation, it just doesn't work. We are way past what we should be stopping putting emissions in the air. As I said, once you put it in, it's there for 300 to 1,000 years. And if your offsetting is not working well enough, we're in deep trouble. And those messages are sort of instinctively being picked up in these stories and so on. And people are beginning to really ask the question, you know, that is this net zero thing really real?
And Charlotte, what do you make of this concern?
I think it's like the waste hierarchy. There is a carbon hierarchy, and offsetting is at the bottom of that. I think first and foremost, you have to look at ways to reduce your emissions in the first place. As Judy was saying, you have to ensure that you aren't putting carbon in the atmosphere first. You have to look at ways to switch your fuels to low carbon methods. You have to look at ways to increase your efficiency. There's lots that you need to do as a scattergun approach, and you can't simply rely on carbon offsetting as the silver bullet at the end. So I think that's what we have to think about it. I think carbon offsetting in itself, I agree with this 35%. It's not a viable strategy for achieving net zero. It can be used as part of a suite of actions to achieve net zero, but it's not by itself a viable strategy. And then for those emissions that you cannot reduce, you cannot offset, you can't do any efficiency savings to help reduce your emissions, this is where carbon offsetting comes in. But we have to make sure that what you are investing in does have this credibility, does have this transparency. And I think a lot of that comes from looking at where you're buying them, understanding the systems. There are a number of different organizations that have clear certificates about where they're kind of trees, what other kind of green solutions, nature-based solutions they're using in their carbon offsetting schemes. But you have to look and see that permanence. And I think government comes in there too. So currently government is looking at greenhouse gas removals and how we can include them within the UK emissions trading scheme. And what that means is that for these nature-based solutions that can help produce carbon offsets, they're looking at how can we produce a transparent and credible offset that does equate to exactly what you think it is. So how can these trees translate to 1 ton of carbon? And I think that's really important, having these overarching systems in place that monitors that and that can give that credibility and transparency. And so I think a huge amount of that comes from governance, making sure that government creates the right systems to manage these kind of offsetting schemes and industries. But at the same time, it's on those that are investing in them to ensure that you are doing the right thing, that you are reducing your emissions in the first place, and then you are checking that these offsets do have credibility to them.
Right. And Tim, how credible is carbon offsetting, would you say? What do you think?
I think it's a bit of a soundbite, if I'm honest. I mean, as Charlotte has just pointed out, I mean, there's a variety of different standards out there. So there's no one standard way of measuring what is carbon offset. So it's a handy thing. It's a nice thing for companies to be able to say we're doing carbon offset, because it plays well to shareholders. It plays well to regulators. But you get into the whole thing about consistency. You get into the whole thing about regulatory oversight. So if I'm buying up lands in poorer areas to plant, am I developing monoculture? Is that going to squeeze out existing biodiversity? So I'm able to tick a box and say I'm doing carbon offset. As the land type itself changes from a changing environment, what does that mean? So the expansion of the Sahara Desert has knocked out much of the carbon offset undertaken by some of the big countries, like Saudi Arabia, because the trees were planted in such a place or of such a type that they didn't survive the desertification of their soil type, the lack of water. And then you get things like the wildfires. So BP and Microsoft, through the Californian wildfires last year, lost almost their entire carbon offset. And so you're going, not only are the carbon offset being destroyed in the fires, but in the process, they're producing more carbon, which is oxymoronic. And at the minute, we've got two huge fires going on in the Greek islands, Kos and Eos, I think they are. And they're actually now beginning to move householders out of some of the areas, going, we've never had fires of this severity this early in the season. So it sounds good, carbon offsetting. I think that there's another thing where we actually just should be saying, if organizations want to buy up land for carbon offsetting, perhaps they should actually not look to do it in that kind of managerial performance management mindset that you have from a spreadsheet, and just say, we're going to buy up areas of the Equatorial Guinea or Equatorial Africa, and just say, we're going to give this back to the locals and let them manage the land in their sustainable way. Let us pay for them so that they don't have to go hunting the wildlife. They don't have to clear fell to develop palm oil, to develop cocoa bean, whatever. Buy the land and let the forests naturally regenerate, and pay the people to do nothing. The problem is, if they get mobile phones and they start to see what they could have if they went somewhere else, you begin to create a false narrative, and they start seeing what other styles of lifestyle could be or should be, or what they could aspire to. And I think that's where you get a real tension beginning to occur, where you have the discrepancy between the global south, for example, and the global north, and the lifestyles expected. That's far bigger than the issue of carbon offsetting, I know, and we don't have time to talk about it this afternoon. But the issue is, carbon offsetting looks good on a spreadsheet. I don't think it delivers anything like what it should in reality.
Thank you, Tim. So we're going to move on to the green skills gap now. So we know this is a hot topic at the moment. We hosted a webinar in April, which attracted over 500 visitors. So 58% of respondents feel there is or will be a green skills gap. Tim, I know it's been on CIWM's agenda for a while now. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the reality is that this sector, in its broadest sphere, is developing very fast. And as the circular economy, as green skills, as efficiency rises up the agenda, we've been looking at this as the Institute for several years. And we recognize that there's not just a shortage of people. There's also going to be a shortage of skills within the people who are already employed. So there's been a lot of work done around equality, diversity, and inclusion in the last couple of years to develop a strategy to encourage people who wouldn't have otherwise previously have thought of moving into the resources and waste sector to consider it as a career choice or a career path. There's lots and lots of scope, from everything from marketeers to lawyers to advertisers to lobbyists to technologists. There is a whole growth range. And I know some of those people I've just mentioned are also some of the ones I've name-checked earlier on as being perhaps part of the issue. But nevertheless, there are different stories to develop, different stories to create and to craft. There's also a whole range of new service skills. I did have a great slide I've used in the past from the Wombles, showing these characters may not exist at the minute. Food technologists, biotechnology experts, software engineers from an environmental space. How do you tweak your AD plant? How do you improve your energy systems in your home? I know it's not directly related to waste, but could it be? Should it be? I've seen small-scale pyrolysis plants based at a domestic setting. Is that a thing? Should that be a thing? So some of the figures we've looked at is, we reckon by 2030, there's probably about 500,000 people are going to be needed in this sector then on full-time employment. We recognize that 80% of those people are currently already in employment. So that means another 20%, another 100,000 people required to be recruited by 2030, which is only 6 years away. Are they coming down the university pipeline? Are they coming through vocational learning? Are they through the apprenticeship schemes? and those that 80% that are already in employment, what sort of reskilling are they going to need to keep up to date with the developments occurring in the sector? How do they create that space to have that retooling and reskilling? Who's providing that retooling and reskilling? Are the universities up for that? Is that going to be vocational training? Is that going to be new trainers moving into this space? So yeah, this is a really dynamic and a really exciting area to be in, because whatever's for sure, over the 30 years I've been involved in it, it has been a roller coaster ride. And the people I am joined the sector with have diversified in such an array of ways, and that's going to continue.
Yeah, something really important within careers and recruitment is diversity. 49% of respondents involved in recruitment have experienced difficulties in recruiting candidates from diverse backgrounds. Judy, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, like Tim says, you know, the green jobs are coming. There's going to be a wave of significant numbers of green jobs, and everyone should have equal opportunities to access these opportunities. But the images of these jobs are not even out there. And a lot of these jobs are hands-on, not just technological, so desk-based jobs and so on. So we need to get people to visualize themselves into the situations of these jobs. You know, I was talking to people about promoting jobs and so on. They say even at secondary school, you know, and children make decisions about what they would like to be very early, you know, 13 years old, and be there, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that. And if they have no images of both the very technological and the very hands-on things, like we need massive numbers of people putting solar panels on roofs. You got to have no fear of heights. You know, the rock climbers should be in for this. You know, you've not got to be imaginative about how you get people to get the skills to climb on roofs, be confident, do things, and then also to have the message out there that a lot of these new jobs are going to be very well paid. Now, these messages has got to get through to interest sectors of society who are not as confident, who do not see themselves in a new territory, and who have problems going into a new territory where they are not seen to be present. So all these things you have to move on different fronts, promote it early in schools, get children to go into work situations to visualize exactly what they're going to do, tell them how well paid it is. And the other thing is to increase the prestige of doing anything green for the future. So parents would say, I'm so proud my children have green jobs, you know. All these things really matter in people visualizing and making an effort to go and learn, to go and spend money on preparing themselves to go into these jobs, pay for training and so on. And even the colleges and so on are struggling with this because somebody's got to invest in colleges for the training. There's a time lag. You need to set up the courses. You need to be sure that the people coming in will bring you the money to actually run those courses. And then you need to run them. And then there's a time lag before they're ready and then go and look for jobs. So a whole number of things we have to be prepared for to really have the green jobs filled that we really need.
Thank you, Judy. Tim, what can the sector do to drive more diverse candidates into the environment sector?
Well, I think Judy's really nailed it.
Yeah.
I mean, she's highlighted that. How do you articulate? How do you showcase these roles, these opportunities, especially if some of them are not very clearly identified just yet? So, you know, there's almost that thing about having a clarion call out saying, if you've got an interest in the environment, if you've got an interest in materials management, if you've got an interest in design, if you've got an interest in nature, this is a sector that you can have a role to play in. In some regards, there'll be existing jobs there, and that could be anything and everything from lifting bins, sorting waste at the curbside, sorting waste in a plant or a facility, all the way through to being a chief sustainability officer for the likes of Microsoft, for the likes of Hewlett-Packard, for the likes of IBM or Google. So there's a whole raft of different pinch points that you can join the sector at. But it is that articulation, it is that taking pride in the sector, and it's that showcasing. How do we get exemplars to go out and to speak knowledgeably not just to the universities, not just to the chancellors to put in place those university courses, but to the school kids so that they want to actually do this. So there is that issue I mentioned earlier on about being victims of our own success. We're not very visible. And the general view of the public towards us is that we have some kind of janitorial role. Our job is just to sweep up after people out in the mix. For all these materials that are gifted to us through these supply chains, how can we make better use of them? How can we present them for reuse in various forms, guises in manufacturing? So there is a huge selling job, which we're trying to pitch into. We rely on the likes of yourselves, we rely on the likes of ESA and others to begin to frame and to shape that. But the broadcast messaging needs to be clear from the get-go. This is a sector, there are lots of job opportunities. You might be able to be lucky and find a job that's cut out for you, but as often as not, you can make the job that you want it to be yourself, because it is so fast moving that the reality is, if you want to develop into an area like circular economy, generally at the minute, it's a big catch-all. But even within circular economy, what do you want to do? Do you want to focus on building materials? Do you want to focus on ironworks? Do you want to focus on leather? Do you want to focus on textiles? Do you want to focus on business design and how businesses operate? Are you going to become an efficiency expert using things like Six Sigma, where you minimize the production of waste from the outset? Are you going to be about a circular economy expert looking at the supply chain? So these are areas of work that are largely underdeveloped just now. So there's a certain push me, pull you. As you move into this space, you bring clients with you. Do the clients trust you to go further? If so, where does that take you? So, as Judy said, it's also play for big impact for a very rewarding area, because it's like a huge family. You can pick up the phone to anybody working in the waste sector, and there is a common understanding and a common bond arising from that disappearing of materials. There is that common language you immediately have. One of the things we have a real problem with, actually, is too many acronyms, too much discussion about LCAs and EPRs and ETSs, and we need to kind of almost simplify the language to make it more accessible to others. But it's a very rewarding area, and it makes you feel good about yourself because you're doing something with all that magic materials that most people don't see.
Yeah, as someone relatively new to the sector, I would completely agree about the acronyms. Charlotte, the 38% that haven't considered making changes to the recruitment practices to encourage more diversity, do you have any ideas for how they could go about to start doing that?
I think a good way to do that is to go back to one of the other questions and looking at partnerships, look at other organizations that are doing well and looking at what practices that they are encouraging to encourage diversity into their applications, see where you can learn from other people and try and implement that in your own organizations. I think that's where you can start. That's where you can understand, go to resources online, understand and look at kind of industries that focus on this, look at kind of specific organizations where this is their niche and try and use them to help bolster your understanding and understand what you can do to help encourage diversity into these areas. I think green skills, it's really important in the sector itself, the waste management sector. I think we need more diversity. I think we've seen a huge movement in the last couple of years for that, but we have to go further. We have to do what Tim is suggesting. We have to make it more accessible and also seem kind of really ground it in that greenness. I think we're often seen as this just, sanitary nature kind of disposal. We have to really frame it in what we do as a sector and the value you have there, looking at reduction, how can you help with kind of reuse and all of that, but also the technical side of things. We've got carbon capture, we've got heat networks, all these really technical areas that will be huge in the coming years. And how can we reimagine those so that it can help this diversity, but also ensure that it seems like an attractive place to work and a good sector that really is helping kind of the green environment and help us achieve net zero.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. That wraps up today's discussion. Thank you for taking part, and Everyone, thank you for listening. The results of the survey are available for you to download via the ESS website, and we hope you can join us at the event on the 11th to the 12th of September in Birmingham. It's free to attend, and more details can be found by the website www.ess-expo.co.uk. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.